This is an important topic for three reasons. One, I think that we're on a continent where the income levels are growing. Africa is moving from a transition of many of its countries being lower income countries to middle income countries, which means that GDP per capita is increasing. A second transition that we see on the continent is clearly the transition from rural to urban, where we see a lot of the rural populations moving into the urban areas, and so we have Africa now being the largest and fastest producer of cities in the world. And finally, the third transition is just our transition from a more rural-based agricultural society into an increasingly manufacturing and services sector. So across the spectrum of these three transitions, first the income levels of the continent, and as we know, we have now passed the 50% mark. We have over 51% of the population living above the poverty line. So with GDP per capita increasing, more movement into the cities, the question about how cities become an important and fundamental part of the African economic structure is an important question that ECA would like to look at and understand how we begin to create different jobs for rural populations that have now come into the cities, and how we increase productivity as people come into the cities, increase incomes, and deliver more prosperous countries and continent, of course. This also requires a transition from how services are delivered from more centralized processes to decentralized processes of service delivery. So I think that these different transitions that are creating the African city, but also the African economy, are questions that we would like to look at to understand the dynamics and see how we can assist policymakers in ensuring that cities that have now become fundamental elements of growth on the continent are appropriately provisioned, have the right governance structures, and that as migration into the cities continues, that everybody, as the SDG says, is taken care of, because when we have stresses on social services in the cities, this could lead to disorder and sometimes conflict, as we see in some parts of the continent. This is related to the first question, where we talk about decentralized processes. As we have more cities being formed on the continent, we will end up having a more decentralized processes of government. This means that we need to begin to look at what taxes local governments can collect, what is the role of local governments in service delivery, what is the role of local governments in facilitating businesses and investments, what is the role of local governments in municipal financing. So these are all questions that we would need to answer to understand how we empower cities first of all, from a financial perspective and a governance perspective, so that they can contribute adequately to economic activity in their cities. But secondly, once they have been empowered from a financial perspective, then the overall design of countries need to understand where the people are and ensure that we can leverage central infrastructure to ensure that this infrastructure links in to regional and city development, so that this development plans and processes are comprehensive. We do not want in every country to have different and varied forms of development. We would like for the cities to continue to be part of a national strategic development plan, but ensure that the specificities of cities, the specificities of their financing, and the kind of balanced fiscal equations are in effect and in place, so that all the cities have the same levels of growth and development, and some cities are not overburdened by migration in and out of their geographical locations. We would also want to work to ensure that the kinds of infrastructure that are needed to increase productivity are provided in the right place. And again, this is where it's important to have local governments and cities as an important element of the discussion on the growth strategies of countries, to ensure that different poles of development respond to the competitive advantages of the different areas of the country. One of the big characteristics of African cities is informality. Today we know that about 61% of the men and 74% of the women in African cities operate in the informal sector. an important strategy both for the government but also for these SMEs, because they are the base and the economic fabric of the society, will be to see how governments can put in place policies that ensure that this private sector and this activity that hitherto is not taken care of in the appropriate ways can come into the economic fabric. One is by seeing how we can improve the doing business environment in cities to ensure that small and micro business owners can open a business very quickly, have access to electricity, have access to water, can do their businesses without onerous cost of paying taxes. The second part is looking at new forms of employment. Of course, in African cities today, one of the big and growing sectors is housing. How can we formalize, do a lot of job training so that we have a lot of the youth in those cities come around businesses that are supportive of the housing sector, of the infrastructure sector in general. And it's important because, again, we have the state, it remains always the overriding economic entity of every country. However, and the state's fiscal balances, the state's macroeconomic performance impacts on businesses across all levels of government. So if you're a corporation that is working in a local or regional economic zone, you still have to depend on the central state when you go out to raise resources. It's important to ensure that the macroeconomic conditions of the country overall are stable and solid and sound, because when one thinks about investing in a particular country, one first asks the question, what is the macroeconomic situation in the country? Then of course you ask for at what area and what location are you going to invest, depending on your investment, if it's a mining investment or an agricultural investment. Most big investments do not necessarily happen in cities, they happen in sub-cities or in the rural areas. And so the entry point, of course, is always the government, it's always the country, it's always the national flag, but after that you go into local areas. The importance of making these linkages is, of course, that you have developments across national corridors and sub-regional corridors, essentially. And so we talk about the Copper Belt, which crosses 4 or 5 countries. We talk about the cotton zones of producing zones of Africa, which cross another 6 or 7 countries. And so while we talk about the large countries, we also talk about those sub-cities that constitute economic productivity areas. And I think that what is important is to ensure that economic activity, economic regulation, the governance systems across the cities that in themselves constitute economic bands, even though they are not part of a country, have the same kinds of economic and governance structures that allow for corporations, the private sector, to operate in a way that is profit-bearing and ensures that one can create value. This is particularly important now as we move towards the CFTA and the breaking down of borders, because as we break more borders, then we will see that a lot of trade on the continent happens at a city-to-city level, and the border states, actually border cities in Africa trade a lot more than when you look at national data about trade between 2 countries. Sometimes that data is not as telling as when you look at trade between 2 cities, the south of DRC, for example, and Rwanda, the north of Cameroon and the south of Chad. A number of examples like this where cross-border trade is quite important. And so what we need to then ensure is that those cities where you have a lot of cross-border trade, and where most of the time it's women, it's trade that is being done by women, that the kinds of facilities, the kinds of infrastructure that are needed are being provided. We also know that cross-border infrastructure is one of the most difficult pieces of infrastructure to provide. But as we move towards the CFTA and we look for growing a more prosperous continent, that we can come together as institutions, as cities, cross-border cities, to strengthen the infrastructure that is needed to increase productivity, to crowd in more investment, and to ensure that we create job-enhancing growth in the areas. Again, it goes back to a question of revenue collection, where the assignment of revenue collection happens at the city level, at the state level, and how the sharing of that revenue is being done so that cities can also develop themselves and provide the services that are needed, while the state continues to provide the more public goods services that central governments are known for providing in most countries across the world. First of all, I think as ECA we are very excited to have this large number of summit attenders here. We believe that the number of people that are attending this summit is a testimony to the growing interest of cities on the continent as a role for and an area where we need to make more policy. It's a testament to the growing importance of cities across the continent and to the leadership of cities in ensuring that we continue to have prosperous development, that the SDG goals are looked at not just the national level but at the cities level. I think that when we look at cities like Lagos now, cities like Lagos are just as important as Jakarta. We know that as we talk about gross domestic products, many of the cities on the continent are going to have GDPs that will be larger than some countries, and so cities on the continent will become essentially the economic motto of our continent. We have now Lagos, of course, we have Cairo, we have Johannesburg that is coming up, we have Nairobi. These are cities, Abidjan, Yaoundé, Douala. These are all cities that I think over time are going to become important parts of Africa's development as we talk about Paris, as we talk about California being having a GDP that is larger than a lot of African countries. The importance then of ensuring that this conversation around cities happens is to see what kinds of infrastructure development we can put in place, what kinds of financing, what new innovations, how we can use digital technology to ensure that as the cities come up, how we can ensure particularly that climate change and climate resilient cities are part of the construct that we begin to put together as we look at cities. We have an advantage on the continent in some cases that our cities are still young and developing. In some cases our cities have gone very far. We need to begin to understand how we can green the cities, and we also know, and we've done a lot of work at the ECA that shows that greening cities and the process of designing green cities is a process that creates more jobs, a process that grows our economies. So I think it's looking at all these new innovations around different cities. A lot of African cities are innovating in different ways, in service provision, in attracting private business, in delivering social services, health and education. And the question is, how can we leverage all these new, interesting and exciting ideas and bring them together with ECA and our other partners, LSE, at the core of taking this information now and synthesizing it so that we can provide relevant information to policymakers and businesses that are looking to come to African cities for investment.